stay exactly where you are, and for a moment, let the modern world with its sterile glass, its safety regulations, and its blue light glow fade into the cold, damp static of the background. Sit a little closer to the hearth. Let the crackle of the burning wood be your anchor. For tonight we are stepping across the threshold of a Victorian dressing room, a place of quiet elegance that masks a screaming reality. Outside, the London fog is a heavy, gray shroud clinging to the iron railings of the square. But inside this sanctuary of vanity, everything is lace, silk, and silver. Or so it seems. We have been conditioned by period dramas and oil paintings to look back at the Victorian lady as a pinnacle of porcelain grace, a fragile flower of modesty and light. But the dressing table was not a place of beauty. It was a laboratory of slow-motion suicide. It was a stage where the actors lived in the light, while the very tools of their trade were forged in the fires of a toxic underworld. Tonight, we walk through the boudoir doors that were never meant to be opened to explore the painted death. Before we descend into the toxic secrets hidden beneath the rouge and the powder, I invite you to join our circle. If you find a strange sort of peace in uncovering the dark, tactile mysteries of the past, please consider leaving a mark of your presence. A like, a thoughtful comment, or sharing this chronicle with a fellow seeker of shadows helps keep our lanterns burning through the long night. Your company is the very heartbeat of these stories, and your engagement is the coal that keeps this fire roaring against the encroaching dark. Imagine you are standing before a heavy mahogany vanity in 1865. You see a woman preparing for a ball. She desires the look of the era. A complexion so pale it suggests she has never felt the sun, cheeks with a faint, ghostly flush, and eyes that shimmer with a strange, glassy intensity. To you, the modern observer, this is the height of elegance. But look closer at the jars. That brilliant, snow-white powder she is dusting onto her skin is not talc. It is ceruse, a thick, opaque paste made of white lead. She's quite literally painting a shroud onto her living face. This was the Victorian beauty's primary tool, and it was a masterpiece of deception. While the world saw a porcelain doll, the lead was already beginning to seep through her pores, entering her bloodstream and slowly rotting the very flesh it was meant to glorify. Contrast this for a moment with your modern life. You worry about the pH balance of your cleanser or the microplastics in your scrub. You have a government agency to vet your mascara. But the Victorian refuge was built on a foundation of lethal ignorance and desperate vanity. The elite wanted the fruit of beauty without acknowledging the poison required to harvest it. This white lead created a vicious cycle of horror. As the lead destroyed the natural texture of the skin, creating sores, gray patches, and deep pits, the woman did not stop. She simply applied a thicker layer of the white poison to hide the damage the previous layer had caused. It was a career counselor's nightmare, a profession where your success in society was directly tied to how efficiently you could kill yourself in private. The lead brought on tremors, blinding headaches, and a slow, agonizing paralysis of the hands known as wrist drop. To be beautiful was to be a walking corpse, preserved in a layer of industrial metal. But the danger did not stop at the skin. It reached into the very sustenance that kept these fragile icons alive. We must talk about the food of the fallen. You complain if your coffee is slightly cold or if your bread isn't artisanal, but in the mid-19th century, every meal was a gamble with a tombstone. The same desire for purity and whiteness that drove women to paint their faces with lead drove bakers to lace their bread with alum. To make a cheap, gray loaf look like the snowy white bread of the aristocracy, they added aluminum sulfate, a chemical that would wreck the digestive system, causing chronic constipation and malnutrition. Imagine sitting down to a refined Victorian breakfast. You pour milk into your tea, expecting the creamy richness of the countryside, but the milk is blue and thin, watered down to increase profits. To fix the color, the dairyman has added pulverized sheep's brains or chalk. To stop the souring smell of milk that has sat in the sun for days, he adds borax or formaldehyde. This was the modern WebMD of the 1850s. If it looks right, it must be healthy. They were eating a landscape of chemicals. Your ancestors weren't just tougher than you. They were being chemically altered by their own groceries. The pickles on the table were a vibrant, unnatural green. achieved by boiling them with copper coins. The red candy given to children was colored with red lead or mercury sulfide. Every bite was a brush with the morgue, a symphony of adulteration that makes our modern concerns about preservatives look like a luxury of the highest order. The Victorian lady sat at the center of this web, her lead-painted face hovering over a plate of alum-bleached bread and formaldehyde-laced cream. She lived in a sensory vacuum of her own making, her body slowly shutting down as the heavy metals and industrial additives went to work on her organs. We think of their era as natural and organic, but it was perhaps the most synthetic and artificial period in human history. They were pioneers of a chemical frontier they didn't understand, turning their own homes into toxic waste sites in the pursuit of a social ideal. As you sit in your honest, modern room, feel the weight of that silence. Imagine spending 3 hours a day applying a toxic mask, then eating a meal that was actively dissolving your stomach lining, all while maintaining a smile of angelic composure. The Victorian mansion was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was also a psychological prison, where even the bread and the butter were weapons. But the fire is shifting, and as we move away from the dining table and toward the more intimate corners of the house, we will find that the hardware of beauty had even more visceral, eschatological horrors in store. For if the food was a lie, the hygiene was a nightmare that even the thickest perfumes could not hide. Stay exactly where you are, for the warmth of the fire is your only protection against the encroaching damp of the past. As we leave the dining room and its adulterated feasts behind, we must descend into the most private and visceral corners of the Victorian existence. In our modern world, we equate hygiene with a sterile, white-tiled bathroom, with hot running water that flows at the turn of a handle, and soaps that are dermatologically tested for our comfort. We live in a world of transparency and scentless cleanliness. But as we step into the wet rooms of the 1860s, I must warn you, the Victorian concept of hygiene was not about health. It was about the desperate, theatrical suppression of the body's natural state. It was a war against the physical self, fought with weapons that were often more lethal than the dirt they sought to remove. The air in a grand Victorian house was never truly fresh. It was a heavy, stagnant soup of coal soot, expensive perfume, and the faint, lingering rot of the sewers that sat beneath the floorboards. To combat this, the Victorian elite did not seek out fresh air, which they often feared as a source of miasma, but instead turned to the most dangerous elements on the periodic table. If the lead on their faces was the shroud, then Mercury was the Quicksilver Demon that inhabited their bathrooms. Imagine a lady of status attempting to cure a simple skin blemish or a patch of freckles. To her, a freckle was a mark of the sun, a sign of the laboring classes who worked in the fields. It had to be erased. And the cure? Lotions and washes laced with corrosive sublimate, a fancy name for bichloride of mercury. She would rub this liquid into her skin, feeling a slight sting that she mistook for efficacy. In reality, the mercury was eating away the top layer of her dermis, leaving behind a raw, unnaturally white glow. But the price was astronomical. As the mercury absorbed through her skin, it began to settle in her brain and her kidneys. It brought on the mercurial tremors, a shaking so profound she could no longer hold her silver tea service. Her gums would swell and blacken, her teeth would loosen in their sockets, and her personality would begin to warp. The Mad Hatter was not a fictional character. It was a biological reality for thousands of people who used mercury-based products every day. This was the shocking contrast of their hygiene. They were so terrified of a speck of dirt on their skin that they invited a neurotoxin to live in their bones. Contrast this with the modern skincare routine you follow tonight. You might complain about a breakout or a bit of dry skin, but you do not face the risk of losing your mind because of your moisturizer. The Victorian bathroom was a place of visceral horror. Water was a luxury. In many grand houses, a full bath was a laborious, once-a-week event that required servants to haul dozens of cans of hot water up 3 flights of stairs. For the rest of the week, hygiene consisted of sponge baths, using water that had sat in a basin for days, often mixed with ammonia to strip the oils from the skin. They weren't just cleaning themselves, they were chemically degreasing their bodies. And then there was the hair. We have been told stories of the long, flowing locks of the Victorian woman, but we are rarely told of the filth that lived within them. Because washing hair with soap and water was an ordeal that could take an entire day to dry, women often went months without a true washing. Instead, they used dry shampoos made of highly flammable petroleum or ammonia. Or worse, they used lead-based combs to darken their hair, unknowingly brushing a slow-motion paralysis into their scalps every morning. The smell of unwashed hair was masked with heavy, oil-based pomades made of bear grease or pig fat, which would turn rancid in the summer heat, attracting flies and lice that nested in the elaborate hair-padded structures of their coiffures. The modern WebMD of the time suggested that if you smelled of roses and lavender, you were clean. It was a total deconstruction of expectations. A woman could be wearing $500 worth of silk and smelling like a spring garden, while beneath those layers, her skin was weeping from mercury sores, and her hair was a sanctuary for parasites. This was the horror of the hidden. The Victorian obsession with the seen versus the unseen reached its peak in the bathroom. They built elaborate mahogany enclosures for their toilets, the water closets, to make them look like fine furniture, as if by hiding the porcelain, they could pretend the act of waste did not exist. Yet, because the plumbing was often primitive, the sewer gases, methane and hydrogen sulfide, would frequently back up into the house, leading to mysterious faintings and illnesses that doctors treated with even more mercury. As you sit in your honest, modern room, listening to the hum of your plumbing, feel the weight of that deception. Imagine living in a world where cleanliness was a chemical mask, where your breath smelled of rotting gums because of your beauty cream, and where every step you took in your silk dress was a battle against the filth clinging to your skin. The Victorian refuge was a masterpiece of sensory suppression. They were pioneers of a world where the surface was everything and the substance was poison. Stay with me, for as the night deepens, we are about to move from the bathroom to the streets and the workshops, where the hardware of society turns from a private poison into a public slaughter. Before we move into the brutal reality of the Victorian workspace, I ask you to stay until the final light is extinguished. The journey through the shadow world is long, but the relief of the return is only earned by those who walk the full path. The fire is shifting, and the next chapter of our chronicle will show you that even the work that built the world was a form of painted death. Stay exactly where you are, and let the embers of the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the room. For we are leaving the sanctuary of the boudoir to face the crushing gears of the Victorian machine. To truly understand the painted death, we must look past the lady in her silk and see the thousands of hands that labored in the dark to keep her world spinning. In our modern era, we speak of work-life balance and ergonomic chairs. We have laws that protect our lungs and our time. But as we step into the factories and workshops of the 1870s, I want you to feel the weight of the brutal routine. A world where your career was not a choice, but a life sentence of physical degradation. Imagine the young women working in the artificial flower workshops of London. They were the creators of the very ornaments the elite used to decorate their hair and gowns. To achieve the vivid, vibrant green that the Victorian heart craved, the famous Paris green, these workers spent 12 hours a day dusting silk and paper with arsenic. There were no masks, no ventilation, and no occupational safety boards to protect them. The air they breathed was a toxic mist of emerald dust. By the age of 20, their fingernails would turn black and rot away. Their skin would erupt in painful weeping sores, and they would slowly succumb to organ failure. They were literally dying to make the world look like a garden. This is the shocking contrast that haunts the ghost path. The lady upstairs wore a crown of flowers that had been watered with the blood and poison of the girl downstairs. Contrast this with your modern workspace. You might find your job stressful or your commute tiring, but you do not return home with green dust in your lungs and the scent of garlic on your breath, the telltale sign of arsenic poisoning. The Victorian career counselors were not there to help you find your passion. They were there to ensure you were a useful cog in the industrial engine until you broke. For the thousands of girls who flocked from the countryside to the city, the choice was simple: the slow death of the factory or the absolute erasure of the workhouse. The workhouse was the Victorian safety net, but it was designed to be so miserable, so dehumanizing, that even the most desperate would prefer the poison of the workshop. In these workshops, the hardware of society was forged. Consider the match girls of East London. They spent their days dipping wood into white phosphorus to create the matches that lit every hearth in the city. The phosphorus was so volatile that the workshops glowed in the dark. But as the fumes entered their bodies, they caused phossy jaw, a horrific condition where the jawbone would literally rot away, glowing a ghostly green in the dark before eventually causing brain damage and death. They were the lamps of the poor, glowing with a light that was consuming them from within. When we talk about Victorian prosperity, we must remember that it was a pyramid built on a foundation of decaying bones. The society above, however, remained willfully blind. The elite lived in a world of maximum sentiment, weeping over poems of lost love while ignoring the literal corpses piling up in the slums that manufactured their luxury. This was the deconstruction of expectations. We think of the Victorians as deeply moral and religious, yet they built a society that functioned on the systematic destruction of the young and the vulnerable. They wanted the scene, the beautiful ball gown, the glowing match, the vibrant green wallpaper, but they refused to acknowledge the unseen price. They were masters of the horror of contact, creating layers of social distance so thick that they could pretend the girl who made their flowers was as mechanical and unfeeling as the steam engines in the docks. As you sit in your quiet, climate-controlled room, protected by laws you likely take for granted, feel the weight of that historical silence. Imagine a world where your value was measured only by the hours of labor you could provide before your jaw rotted or your lungs failed. The Victorian world was not a romantic era of balls and tea parties. It was a brutal, industrial struggle where even the air you breathed was a commodity owned by someone else. The painted death was not just on the faces of the wealthy, it was the very fabric of the city. But do not turn away yet, for the night is reaching its coldest hour. As we move from the workshops of the living into the wards of the dying, we will find that the cure was often more terrifying than the disease. Before we enter the realm of Victorian medicine and the fear of the state, I invite you to subscribe to this circle if you haven't already. Join us as we continue to peel back the layers of history. For only by witnessing the darkness can we truly appreciate the light of our own time. Stay with me, for the fire is gasping for air, and the next threshold we cross is one of iron and ether. The fire is gasping for air now, the wood turning to a skeletal white ash, much like the faces of those who sought refuge in the cold, iron-scented wards of the Victorian infirmary. As we leave the toxic workshops behind, we must confront the final, most intimate betrayal of the painted death, the era's medicine. In our modern world, we view the doctor's office as a place of data, precision, and consent. We have the luxury of antibiotics, anesthesia that we trust implicitly, and a legal system that recognizes our right to our own bodies. But as we step into the shadow of a 19th century hospital, I want you to feel the fear of the state, a world where the cure was often a more efficient killer than the disease, and where the poor were not patients, but raw material for the advancement of a science they didn't understand. To be sick in the Victorian era was to enter a landscape of refining horror. If you were a lady of high standing, suffering from the lead-induced tremors or the mercury-rotted gums we discussed, your physician would likely diagnose you with hysteria or nervous exhaustion. The treatment, a cocktail of laudanum, opium dissolved in high-proof alcohol, and rest. You weren't being healed. You were being sedated into a chemical stupor. Laudanum was the modern WebMD for every ailment from a headache to a broken heart. It was sold over the counter, cheaper than beer, and it turned entire households into shadow realms of addiction. Mothers gave infants quietness, syrups laced with morphine, to their crying babies, unaware that they were slowly starving their children's brains in the pursuit of a quiet nursery. But if you were poor, the medical refuge was a place of iron and ether. Surgery in the mid-1800s was a spectator sport. Before the widespread use of antiseptics, speed was the only measure of a surgeon's skill. A man like Robert Liston could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes, but the tools were unwashed. The surgeon's apron was stiff with the dried blood of previous patients, and the air was thick with the miasma of infection. This is the shocking contrast that defines the era. They were sophisticated enough to build the Crystal Palace, yet they didn't realize that washing their hands could save thousands from the hospital gangrene that claimed more lives than the original injuries. Contrast this with the cura e resiliencia you know today. You have the right to know what is in your IV bag. The Victorian patient had no such power. Justice was not for the individual, it was for the social order. If you were found wandering the streets in a state of mercurial madness or lead palsy, you weren't given a therapist, you were sent to the asylum. These were not places of healing, but warehouses of the forgotten, where the painted death reached its psychological climax. Inside those damp stone walls, the state exerted absolute control over the body. You were stripped of your clothes, your name, and your dignity, becoming a mere case study for a medical establishment that was obsessed with categorizing the unfit. This was the deconstruction of expectations regarding Victorian justice. We think of them as the founders of modern law and order. Yet for the average person, the law was an iron fist hidden in a silk glove. If a worker died of arsenic poisoning in a wallpaper factory, it was seen as an act of God or personal frailty, never the fault of the industry. The state protected the seen, the commerce and the image of the empire, while the unseen were left to rot in the wards. They were pioneers of a world where the law was a barrier designed to keep the invisible army from ever claiming their humanity. As you sit in your quiet room, feeling the safety of your modern rights, imagine the terror of realizing your own body is failing you, and the only person who can help is a man with a blood-stained saw and a bottle of opium. Imagine the helplessness of having no voice in a system that viewed your suffering as a statistical necessity. The Victorian world was a masterpiece of control, but it was also a psychological prison where even your breath was under the jurisdiction of a cold and distant authority. But the night has one final threshold for us to cross. As the embers pulse like a dying heart, we must face the climax of the painted death, the point where the pursuit of beauty, the poison of the industry, and the failures of medicine all met in a final, dark embrace. Before we move to the end of our journey, I want to ask you something. Do you feel the gratitude for the light of our century yet? Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this Victorian reality would you have feared the most? Stay with me, for the fire is almost out, and the morning fog is beginning to lift. The fire has dwindled to a single pulsing ember, a lonely red eye staring out from the darkness of the grate as if witnessing the final, exhausted breath of an era. We have walked through the toxic boudoirs, the mercury-stained bathrooms, and the arsenic-dusted workshops. But now, we must face the ultimate climax of the painted death, the moment when the Victorian obsession with the ideal collided with the cold reality of the grave. In our modern world, we find comfort in the fact that even in death, we are treated with a certain biological honesty. But for the Victorian, the deception did not end when the heart stopped beating. The painted death was a cycle that pursued them even into the earth, turning the very act of remembrance into a final, gilded horror. Imagine the grand finale of a life lived in the shadow of the lead shroud. As the poisons we have discussed, the arsenic in the wallpaper, the mercury in the medicine, the lead on the skin, finally claimed their victim, the Victorian culture of death took over. This was the miseria generale of a society that could not stop performing. The mourning was not a private grief, it was an industrial production. Widows were forced into deep mourning, draped in heavy black crepe fabric that was itself treated with toxic dyes that irritated the skin and lungs, literally making the bereaved ill with the weight of their sorrow. They wore jewelry made of the hair of the deceased, weaving the physical remains of the dead into the fashion of the living. It was a world that refused to let go, a society that preferred a beautiful corpse to a healthy living soul. This is the shocking contrast that brings us to the edge of the abyss. The Victorians spent their lives poisoning themselves to look like angels, and once they died, they used the same poisons to pretend they were still alive. Embalming fluids of the time were cocktails of arsenic and mercury, pumped into the veins to preserve the porcelain look for the funeral. They were so terrified of the natural process of decay, the ultimate horror of contact with our biological reality, that they turned their cemeteries into chemical wastelands. They were pioneers of a world where even the soil was not safe from their vanity. Contrast this final misery with how you feel tonight. As you sit in your modern home, look at the walls around you. They are painted with safe, water-based pigments, not layers of arsenic. Look at your medicine cabinet, filled with vetted science and clear labels, not bottles of infant's quietness or liquid mercury. You live in an age of transparency and light. We have deconstructed the expectations of the past and found them wanting. We have realized that a life lived in the pursuit of a toxic, invisible ideal is no life at all. The painted death eventually collapsed not just because of science, but because the human spirit could no longer breathe beneath the weight of the lead and the lace. As the morning light begins to bleed through the fog outside and the cold gray ash on the hearth finally goes still, take a deep, clear breath. Feel the air in your lungs. It is clean. Feel the skin on your face. It is yours, unpainted and alive. You have survived the ghost path and the toxic chambers of the 19th century. We have looked into the shadow world and seen the price of the refuge our ancestors built. It was a beautiful hollow lie, bought with the stolen health of millions who were told that to be seen was a sin, and to be pure was to be poison. I thank you for staying with me until the final light was extinguished. If these chronicles of the painted death have touched a chord in your soul, if you feel a newfound gratitude for the simplicity of our modern safety, then our journey has been a success. Join our circle again when the sun sets, for the past has many more secrets to whisper to those who are brave enough to listen. Tell me in the final silence of this evening, does the beauty of the Victorian era still look the same to you, or can you now see the cracks in the porcelain? Stay safe, stay seen, and remember, the most beautiful thing you can ever wear is the truth of your own reflection. Until the lanterns are lit again, the hearth is cold, but the story remains.